Welcome to Into the Supernatural with Jen, Lilley, and Billy Hallowell, where we dive deep into biblical truth. From miracles to spiritual warfare, we're exploring the unseen realm and uncovering how God still moves today. And today, we're joined by pastor and best-selling author John Burke, who spent years investigating near-death experiences and what they reveal about eternity. Let's step beyond the natural and into the supernatural.
Well, John Burke, it is super exciting to reconnect with you and have you on today. A lot to talk about. We're going to talk about near-death experiences. And I know this is a loaded question because it's a complicated backstory, but what was it that motivated you, that drove you to want to tackle NDEs?
Well, it was kind of an accident. I was an agnostic. Grew up going to church, but I ended up studying engineering and working as an engineer. So my mind has always worked like that, like skeptical. How do you know? Is there any evidence? Why does that make sense? And nobody could really answer my question. So I just decided Jesus is probably a good man who turned legend, and God, you just can't know. There's no evidence. And then my dad was dying of cancer. And, this is almost 40 years ago. And someone gave him the very first research on near death experience. So, coined the term near death experience, which, if you don't know what that is, it's when people clinically die. So, like, even no heartbeat, no brain waves for minutes to hours. And yet they're resuscitated either by modern medicine or, quite honestly, some cases just miracle, because there's no way you can't explain it any other way. But I saw this book on his bedside table and I pick it up and I'm curious. I start reading it and I couldn't put it down. And at the end, I said, oh my gosh, like this might be the evidence I've been looking for. And because so many of them, they talk about how they were in a place more real than this, more alive than this, and many times in the presence of this God of light and love, who was personal, who knew them intimately. They never wanted to leave his presence. Many of them knew this was Jesus or saw him as Jesus. And again, I'm a skeptic and an agnostic. I'm like, what? And it was just enough. It didn't convince me. It just opened my mind. And because of that, I actually started reading the Bible and studying the Bible. And after a year or so, for other reasons, actually for fulfilled prophecy in history that I didn't know was there either, I came to faith in Christ. So, the weird thing is, I just kept my curiosity was insatiable. I was always like, the more I learned about the Bible and studied, and then I kept running into more of these stories, which, interestingly, God, I believe, I was working as an engineer out in Santa Barbara, California, which ended up to be the hub of the research that the medical doctors, who were the first researchers, where they were studying most of the patients.
Wow, no way. That's
So
incredible.
yes, coincidentally,
Yeah.
I kept running into them, and I kept, and the way my mind would go, I'd be like, wait, I heard that. And that person talked about a life review, and that person talked about this. And I see that's where Jesus said this and I literally started charting it. And I gave my first talk on this at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1989.
Wow.
So I've studied close to 1,500 cases of clinical death and resuscitation since
Wow.
then. And, in 2015, I wrote the book Imagine Heaven, really showing how there are about 40 commonalities of what people say,
Yeah.
and all 40 are found in the Bible.
It's incredible.
And and then a year and a half ago, I wrote Imagine the God of Heaven, really honing in on how people all over the globe, 70 people I interviewed on every continent, every religious background, but they're encountering the same God. And it's the God who revealed himself in the Jewish prophets and through Jesus. And I'm just basically showing how the character and the attributes of who they're experiencing fully aligns.
One of the things that I really love, and I don't know the statistics, and I know that you do, is how many people basically in any given day around the globe die, and then how many of those have a near-death experience. I think it was like 5% or something, but do you recall this
Yeah,
statistic?
yeah. Well, the Gallup poll did a survey of America and found 1 out of 25 Americans. So
So
that's like 13 million Americans claims to have had a near-death experience. More recently, in 2019, the European Academy of Neurology reported on a study across 35 countries. They said that 10% of the population across 35 countries has had a near-death experience. Now,
that's fascinating to me.
I still think it's more like 5%, because when
Yes.
I dove into the data, the ones who were actually at or near clinical death, more like 5%. So if here's the thing, like, I'm still a skeptic. So if someone has an experience and they call it a near-death experience, but they're not really clinically dead or very, very close, I'm kind of like, I don't know, maybe. I mean, you kind of got to take
Or
their
is it a
word, but
vision? Is it a vision at that point, right? Is it some sort
and
of
it
and
could
maybe
be, and
them, right?
it could be, but I got to tell you, when they show you scars in their neck where the knife went in here and came out there, or the bullet wounds, or hospital records, dead an hour and 45 minutes, well, that to me has a lot more like, okay, tell me what you have to say.
Yeah, exactly. So 4% of Americans on average, because 1 in 25 is what you said, and then like about 10 global, but we're thinking like 5 is a fair assessment.
I think 4 to 5% is 1 out of 20, 1 out of 25.
Which is
It's a
still like
lot.
thousands of people a
It
day
is.
across the globe that are experiencing this. And one of the things I love about your books, and I really appreciate about your skepticism, is that you note in these books that I'm obsessed with that you only really take the testimonies of people who have a lot to lose. So they're not people that are telling this story because, oh, they're going to be gaining fame or their moment in the spotlight. These are people, lawyers, doctors. I remember I recall one was an astronaut or something like that, an aerospace, physicist or something like that, where
Yeah,
very
lawyer,
soon
aerospace
people would,
engineer, surgeons,
I mean, a normal
bank
person who has a
presidents. I mean,
steady
you don't
job
typically
doesn't
have.
want to say, I died and went to heaven or I died and went
Right,
to hell because you sound insane. And so
right.
No.
I love that these are the testimonies that you've included in here because they understand, they have such conviction about what they experienced that they're
Well, they have a
willing
lot to
to,
lose.
they have a lot to lose. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing with this because you have, I mean, even within the church, and you know this, John, because I mean, you've gotten this reaction from people too. There are people who will say this is not biblical, this is not true, this is not, and I want to get into all this, but it makes it
Yeah.
hard to share the stories, A, because they feel strange, Jen, like what you were just saying, but B, when even the people in your own camp who should support what you may be saying, and again, we should have skepticism always and vet things, they're coming after you. So it's not just the atheists and the agnostics, it's the Christians too sometimes who are struggling with this. Why do you think that is?
Oh yeah, I think I know why that is, because that's why I stayed quiet, having done all this research for so many years. I say that it literally took me 35 years to write Imagine Heaven, because I had a lot of questions too. And look, I do not believe everything every near-death experiencer says.
Sure.
I don't, and I don't encourage people to. And that's because these people are having an experience that's truly multidimensional, and so they're having to interpret somewhat what they're experiencing. But what I like to use an analogy, like, imagine we're living this three-dimensional experience, right, on a flat black and white painting in this room.
This is my favorite analogy in your book, by the
Oh,
way.
okay.
Such a good
Well,
analogy.
I've used this with people I've interviewed that have had near-death experience, and they say exactly that's why it's so difficult to talk about and why they often stay quiet. Because how do you explain something they say is more real than this,
And so to
right?
finish your analogy though, it's like as if when they died, they come out of this 2D black and white painting into the room and they
Which is
look
three
back,
dimensions.
which is like 3 dimensions, and they
Yeah,
look
and and
back
and
at the
think
painting
So if you live if we're experiencing this experience in a two-dimensional world, we have up and down, we have side to side. We can't even conceive of in or out. There's no dimension called in or out.
Right.
So death means separation. So imagine at death, your soul is peeled, your two-dimensional soul is peeled off that two-dimensional body, and now your soul is experiencing both two dimensions and three dimensions in this room of color, and you can observe what's going on in your flat two-dimensional world because it's contained within this greater three-dimensional reality.
It's the
And
best
then you're
analogy.
pressed back in, you're resuscitated in two dimensions, and you're struggling with words to describe multi dimensions and color and black and white two-dimensional terms. And
Right.
so they're having to grapple for words and interpret. Now, what they do consistently say are they describe these 40 commonalities, and they describe things that also can be verified. And that's what started to convince me.
Can you
Okay.
list some of those things?
Yes.
Sorry, Billy.
No, I'm sorry. It was your turn, but I was like, yes, please list these things. I need to hear them.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I'm I'm working as an engineer. I've now become a follower of Jesus, but I'm still asking the questions there too, trying to figure things out. And I keep running into these, and I'm kind of categorizing them and all that. And I'm asking the same questions, like, well, how do you know these aren't hallucinations, or drugs, or the brain being flooded with chemicals as the brain is dying? And these are all theories that alternate explanations. Dr. Michael Shermer, who's a skeptic and an atheist, says no, we know it's brain based. Well, there are several. In Imagine the God of Heaven, I go through 10 points of evidence that convince me this cannot be brain based, because brain based does not explain the evidence. So one is veretical observation. So they can make observations. So imagine you come, out of the two-dimensional painting, but you're still looking at what's going on in the two dimensions while you're in three. Well, that's exactly what happens when people die. They say they leave their bodies, but often they're up above their bodies in the room where their resuscitation is taking place. And they can observe and later report things that can be verified that are actually happening. So, for instance, I interviewed this cardiologist. A lot of the early researchers were cardiologists, and Dr. Michael Sabum, and he was a skeptic about near-death experiences. He thought, that's not true. I've never heard that from any patient. Well, then he started actually asking his patients, right? And then they start telling him again and again. And after 5 years of research, he actually wrote up an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, so JAMA. And what he said is, these patients were telling me things about what I did resuscitating them that they could not possibly have known, and so accurate that I could have used the recording to teach other physicians how to do resuscitation.
Wow.
Wow, that's amazing.
So, yeah, and I report on, like in Imagine the God of Heaven, like for instance, a woman in London who dies giving childbirth. She comes up out of her body. A lot of the commonalities, she travels through this portal or tunnel, this gorgeous world of beauty in the presence of this God of light who is love and knows her life review. And then God says, your son, Michael, is going to live. You need to go back because he's going to need you. So she comes back. And as she's coming back, she passes through the ceiling of the hospital and notices, the ceiling of the room where the resuscitation is taking place, and notices a sticker on the top side of the ceiling fan. This is in the 90s when they still had ceiling fans in hospitals. And she comes to, and she's so excited trying to tell the doctors and nurses about this incredible experience and meeting God. And they're like, yeah, you're hallucinating. And she gets one nurse and says, look, you did this and said this. And, and the nurse knew, wait, you were comatose. You couldn't have known that. You didn't have any heartbeat or brain waves. And Mary, the woman who had the near-death experience, said, I can prove it to you. Go get a ladder, Look on the top side of the ceiling fan and you're going to see a red sticker, and here's what it says. And sure enough, she got the ladder and it checked out. Now, you could say, oh, good internet story, right? Because it sounds like that. But there are thousands of them, and they've been studied scientifically. So Dr. Janice Holden found, she did a study of about 100 cardiac arrest patients having near-death experiences, making observations that could be checked out. Each may make, 10, 15 observations. She found 92% of their observations were completely accurate. 92%. While they had no brain waves,
Right.
another 6% were mostly accurate. Maybe some details varied. Only 2% were inaccurate, and that turned out to be one of the patients in the study.
Wow.
That's unbelievable. So as a skeptical engineer, I was like, okay, this is grounded in our reality. This is not hallucination. The second thing that convinced me is that when people blind from birth have a near-death experience,
Yes.
they can see. And I report on about 6 people that I interviewed or studied in the 2 books, Imagine Heaven and Imagine the God of Heaven. And to me, that is like, that's mind-boggling because they report all the same things as sighted people. And
Wow.
interestingly, one of the things that convinces me that, like a non-believer skeptic might not get, but all the blind people say if they experienced heaven, they talk about the light of heaven was not like the light on earth. Now, remember, they're blind when they died, and when they're resuscitated, they're still blind. So they've only felt the sun's light, right? They say this light was so brilliant that they knew they couldn't look at it if they were in their normal body on earth and had eyesight. And the light was palpable, they say. It was love and life all together as one, and it was coming out of everything, coming out of the grass, coming out of the trees and the birds and the flowers and even the people, this welcoming committee of people coming toward them. Now, blind people talking about the light of heaven, interestingly, most Christians don't even know. That's what Isaiah says in Isaiah 60. There is no sun or moon in heaven, for God is its light. And then John sees the holy city of God and reports in Revelation 21, there's no sun or moon, for the glory of God is its light. And the Lamb, meaning Jesus, is the lamp, and the nations will walk in that light. Now think about that. That's exactly what blind people are reporting. And of course, we always wonder, what is the glory of God? It says in Romans 8, we will share in God's glory if we share in his suffering. So what does that mean? Well, the glory of God is not only this light, but the very love of God, because God is love, and the life of God. Remember, Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. So light and love and life, that's filling and giving energy to everything and coming out of everything. And it's amazing
Yeah.
because all these things, like Jesus even talked about that. Matthew 13, he says, and then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom forever.
Yeah.
Right? And the welcoming committee, in Luke 16, he says, use your worldly resources to make friends so
Yes.
that when it's all gone, they will welcome you into an eternal home.
Yeah, it's
Mm.
incredible. That's something that I said before we started recording. I can't tell you. I mean, like I have multiple copies of the book because I travel a lot as an actress, and inevitably I always bring it on a plane because I'm like, oh, I'm going to finally get some time without 4 kids to read this book, and I start reading, and then I meet somebody who lost somebody, and I'm like, did they know Jesus? Did they not? Like, here you go, and I give them your book. But one thing that has comforted me immensely, well, 2 things is first in your book, a lot of these NDEs describe, sunsets or like mountains. And I don't know if I am accurate in saying beaches, but like landscapes that we have here on Earth. And I find that so comforting because while I'm here, I want to be about my father's business. Like it is my John 4, Jesus says, like, it is my bread to do the will of God. And so by doing that, I'm giving up, bucket list trips. Like, oh, I really want to go to Iceland one day. And I hope I get to because I have a degree in geology and I love volcanoes. And maybe there won't be volcanoes in heaven, but I am so comforted to know that all of these destinations I would like to go to, some of the people describe almost like telepathically. They think of it and then they can be there. They're seeing this most majestic mountainscape, or they're experiencing a beach or like water, except there's no jellyfish or anything that you have to worry about or sunburn. And I'm like, that is so encouraging to me that
No
we can
jellyfish
really,
is very encouraging.
it's,
No
it is
jellyfish.
very, no mosquitoes, all these things. But I'm like, how incredible and kind is the Lord. And I know, because in the Bible there's so many descriptions of like, well, worship him, and obviously, of course, you would say like holy, 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 and worthy, 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 because you can never reach the depths of who God is. And I just imagine in every like moment there's a new thing that he reveals about himself, where you would never get bored. But I used to be a worship leader, and I'm like, even as like somebody who has extreme heart of worship, I'm like, wouldn't you get tired of that? And so, and I know that you wouldn't, but it's like, it almost sounds like to somebody who doesn't love Jesus, like, why would I want to worship God all day? But I also think, based on these NDEs, that they're just, the people have these accounts where they're hanging out with people that they love, which is so encouraging to me as well. And they're spending time with them, and there's fellowship, and there's these like, not really sunsets, but what I imagine people are describing is almost like a northern lights type
Mhm.
experience, where it's like a dusk or like a, sunrise, but there's no real sunset, that there's like shades of day.
It
It's just,
shifts. Yeah.
yeah, like it's
Well,
fascinating.
Jen, I think you're right. One of the reasons I finally wrote this is because I realized, even Christians have a horrible view of heaven, and so no wonder we don't live for it. It says in
Yeah.
Colossians 3, set your
Mm.
mind on things above, not things of the earth, because that's where your life is, hidden
Right.
in the heavenlies. It's
Yeah.
life, and that's what people miss.
Yeah.
This
Okay.
life to the next life is continuous. So when I interview these near death experiencers, it's so funny. Like um, Dr. Mary Neal or Howard Storm or almost all of them, I'll usually say at some point, like, "Do you know you're dead?" And they're like, "Well," and they kind of chuckle, like, "No, but I'm starting to realize because I feel more alive. I go
Wow.
from conscious to more conscious, from alive to more alive."
So Bruce
And
Fanatta, I have to interrupt.
yeah.
Bruce Fanatta, when he was sharing his story recently about when he died, when the truck crushed him, and he rose above his body, he was saying that he was looking at his body, but didn't recognize that it was him almost. Like he was watching himself, but even though he was moving towards, he wasn't in heaven yet, but like moving towards that. And I thought that was so interesting. Like he wasn't connecting the dots, that the man he felt bad for on the ground was actually him. And I had not heard
Yeah.
anybody say that before. I don't know if you want to react to that, but I wanted to mention it because of what you just said.
Yeah, well, sometimes they don't know they're dead. Sometimes they see their body and they recognize it, and they're like, "Oh, I must be dead." And but they don't. They're not panicked usually. They feel wonderful. So a couple of things, Jen, that I think helps is to realize, Jesus said, "God is not the God of the dead; He's the God of the living." And so many times you know, we think so small. We
Yeah.
think heaven is going to be ethereal and wispy and not real and tangible.
Yes.
But we fail to forget, and what near death experiencers tell us is that no, actually, this life is the shadow. That's the real thing.
It's so
So
encouraging.
and time, what we also forget, because uh, my worship leader, love him to death, used to always say, sing with all your heart because we're going to be worshiping God forever. So you better get used to it. And I'd be like,
Yeah.
an endless church service sounds bad to me. And I'm a pastor, right?
Right.
So,
No, exactly. Exactly. Like this, that's a
right.
lot. Like that seems just like a lot.
It's a lot. It
So,
is a
so,
lot.
but here are a couple things you got to realize. One, we are imprisoned. And I use that word intentionally, imprisoned to a degree for a time on a linear one-dimensional
Yeah.
timeline,
Hmm.
right? But as soon as you cross over, It's what Peter said in 2 Peter 3:8. To the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And NDEs say almost the same thing.
Yeah.
Some of them say there was no time. And others say, well, there was time, but it was like past, present, and future all simultaneously in a moment. Or like, well, there was time and things changed, but at each moment you had all the time you needed, which I go into in Imagine Heaven, that
Yes.
if you had two-dimensional time at each moment on our successive line of time, you would have another timeline where you could spend all the time you needed at that point in time.
Right.
So the point is, what I like to say is, imagine heaven as this life, because by the way, God created this life.
Right.
Every single good gift, everything you love about this life came from him, and yet this life is marred. It's the wounded version that is groaning, Paul says. It's groaning under death and disease and famine, to be liberated. And so everything you love about this life is what's coming, but not imprisoned by just these three dimensions
Yeah.
or single dimension of time. And so it's more like, because all the things we experience here, work and fun, and there's my timeline.
If you're interested, it's page 132 and 133. You do
That's
such
my
a good job.
engineered
I
geek
really,
brain geeking out.
I mean, it's funny because I love science too. One of the things I love, I just want to touch on that's so fascinating to me in the books, because again, all of it, like I haven't really gotten to read Imagine the God of Heaven. I want to, and it's like I want to cry even thinking about it, because just the way people describe like the love of God, it's just,
I like it better.
yeah. I mean, it's just
I do, because
incredible.
it's when you read how these people describe the characteristics or attributes of God that you see in the scriptures, it's like love. Okay, we say
Yes.
God is love, but that word does not do it.
No.
No.
They say things like, take all of the love you've ever felt for a child, from a spouse, a mother, a parent, a grandparent, put all of it together in a moment, and then blow it up by 1,000,000,000.
Right. I
Like,
remember some guy, I think it was the astronaut, was saying he felt this like roiling, like he described it as like this roiling love that was
oh,
like
that's
flowing out of God, like just like, and you feel it like in you and through you. It's like your whole body can just feel engulfed and known and not shamed. And
oh
and
no,
I,
they say things like, what you realize in the presence of God is that he's always been your best friend. Like there's no one else who has gone through every bit of life, every high, every low, and understands you, even understands the whys better than you do, and yet is crazy in love with you.
it's amazing.
It is
Yeah.
amazing. I told you guys I just started this podcast, and what I'm doing is
Yes.
kind of like I write my books. I'm teaching what the Bible says about a particular thing, but then I'm letting you hear it illustrated from these people I've interviewed.
Wow.
Because I've got hundreds of hours of video interviews I've written my books off of that I've just never. I was just using them to write the books,
Yeah.
and so
And that's
you
on your
hear,
YouTube? Is that how people can,
yeah, it's on the
I can
YouTube.
watch it. I'm gonna go watch it
You
tonight.
can't go. So go watch. I did one, not the last one. That's hellish NDEs. Don't start there.
Okay, but I'm really interested in that too. I mean, there's so much to
Well,
talk about,
so the one called The Ecstatic Love of God. And when you hear these people from all over the globe describing, grappling for words, and Ron, the he was actually a neurologist who said he's the one, he got
yeah,
stabbed
stabs,
13
right?
times,
Yeah,
and he showed me where it went through his right through here and came out the other side. And he, as he's a medical doctor, so he told me all the things that should have been hit and killed him. I mean, talk about miracle, right?
right.
And all of a sudden time stands still, and he said, there before me was this explosion of light. He said, imagine being 5 feet away from the source of a nuclear explosion. It was like that, roiling with light and energy. He said, but what was roiling even more was the love
Yeah.
and he chokes up. And that's the
Yes,
other
I
thing. It's
know. And he's like,
amazing.
just talks about how humble he is at the same time, like God. It's like,
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly. And when he says, but yeah.
well, just like as we're talking about this, because what your willingness to write the book and talk about this so openly over the years, over the last 10 years now that you've been really doing this in depth, it opens up a lot of conversations for people. Even Jen, as you're getting emotional thinking about this, I think so many people have had these experiences. And again, they don't want to share them because of different factors or how people are going to react. I find the same thing with miracles and the same thing with demonic encounters. All of these things that are in the realm of what we talk about on this show, they're very difficult to talk about. What impact has this had on you, both positive and negative? But I'm kind of interested in the negative side in terms of, as a pastor diving into this stuff, what sort of reaction do you get from people because of the complexity of sharing this sort of thing the way you have?
Oh yeah. I get lots of great comments on my YouTube, and sometimes I want to quit after looking at my comments because
don't
I
read
get
the
some.
comments. Don't read the
Never
comments.
read the comments,
Well,
never. Uh,
but I kind of see it. I see it as a ministry. I
Yeah.
was a
yeah.
pastor for 27 years, and this is now, trying to minister to people and help people. And I mean, there's so many stories of like, I lost my son, and this has given me so much hope, and
Yes.
things like that. Um, but yeah, so it kind of goes back to what you were asking before, about why people were hesitant, and especially Christians, to talk about this for really, really until about 2010.
Hmm.
Um, and it's why I didn't write a book. I wrote other books, but I didn't feel like it was time to write about this because I honestly, until Christians started talking about it, I didn't have some interpretive keys to help me understand what's going on.
Okay,
So
cool.
what was happening in the 80s, when I'm studying this, medical doctors are studying this, more and more articles and things are coming out, but people are having these sacred experiences with this God of light. They go to their church, and the pastor says, because they say also things like, well, I was out of my body and I floated around the hospital and I noticed things, and they're like, okay, that sounds weird. That must be satanic. Stay away from it. That's what they would
Right.
say. So many churches rejected them. And as a result, they rejected the church because they're like, this was more real than anything I've ever experienced. And I, I want to understand it. And so as a result, a more new agey interpretation began to form in that community. And that was confusing, honestly. But here's part of what I realized after seeing all 40 commonalities, and after Don Piper, who was a pastor, had one and wrote about it, other Christians felt comfortable coming forward. And so I was able to see, one, if you have a very shallow near death experience, meaning you die, you leave your body, you have heightened senses, because again, this life is the lesser, that life is the greater. And the greater experience of both the good, the heavenly, and the bad, the evil, the hellish. So really, this life is a merciful taste of heaven and hell for a time. It's the time of choosing, right? But what happened is, um, I think many of these people, Christians especially, stayed quiet and through the 80s and through the 90s, and so they got interpreted as more of a new age kind of thing. But I was seeing all along, no, I mean, all of this is in Scripture. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like, they'll say things like, "Oh, I had all these new powers in this spiritual body, like I could travel at the speed of thought, right? Or I could float and fly or kind of glide along. I had telescopic vision. I could see
Yeah.
thousands of miles as if right up close."
That's so amazing to me. I thought about that so many times. Yeah.
Well, but think about that. So back in the 80s or 90s, that's like, or telepathic communication, thought to
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah, a lot of people say
So
that, right? Like, you can talk, you can make noise, you can sing, but you're usually just, it's too much effort. You're just
You don't need to.
carrying
Yeah.
on like more than one conversation at once, like with other people
But
telepathically.
back in the 80s and 90s, Christians would categorize all that as like, oh, that's like astral transportation things, and
Sure.
it's
Yeah,
new agey,
astral
stay away
projection
from it.
and yeah.
Astral projection. But here's the thing, I'm finding all this in the scriptures.
Yeah.
So for instance, Paul, I think, had a near-death experience. Not sure, but in Acts chapter 14, it says he was stoned to death when a mob turned on him in Lystra, dragged him out of the city, and left him for dead. And the believers pray for him, and he gets back up and goes back in the city and starts preaching again. Okay.
Right.
Now, first of all, I wouldn't do that if they just stoned me to death, right? But
Right.
second, how do you survive something like that and then go after it again unless miraculously he was revived, right? And then he says in 2 Corinthians 12 about himself, 14 years ago, whether in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. I was taken up to paradise. I was taken to the third heaven, and I heard and saw things inexpressible.
Right.
So was that 14 years ago what happened in Lystra? Maybe so.
So good.
And then he talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, our bodies are buried a natural body, but they're raised a spiritual body. They're buried in weakness, but they're raised, and the Greek word is duname, from which we get dynamite. They're raised in new powers.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's exactly what these near-death experiencers are describing. And even the telescopic sight, go read Revelation 21, where John is taken by Jesus into heaven up on a very high mountain looking out over the holy city, which, by the way, commercial airline pilots who have flown in after dying describe that same mountain over the holy city. And they say it's higher than the Himalayas. It's huge.
Yeah. Amazing.
Okay, so John is up on a mountain higher than the Himalayas, and he's describing the holy city. How is he reading the names on the foundation stones?
Oh, that's so good.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
How does the Holy Spirit communicate to us? It's not audible. I've never heard audible words.
Right. It's like
what I've heard are impressions in my mind and in my soul.
Yes.
Right? And Jesus said, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. In other words, you've got to develop your spiritual sense of hearing, but it's more like, they describe it as telepathy, but they often say, no, it's more than just thoughts. It was thoughts and feelings and everything associated before and after. It's perfect, pure communication. You can't misunderstand.
Yeah. It's so
That's going to save a lot of our relational problems, right?
Yeah.
It's going to fix a lot.
Yeah. There's just so
absolutely.
much that I think is comforting. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. I could talk to you all day, every day for years and probably not get to the depths of like all the questions I have. So
I know, or probably get me to answer anything you actually ask. So Billy, the negative, when I went to press send in 2015 on the manuscript for Imagine Heaven, I literally said, okay, Lord, this may be the end of my ministry, but it's what you asked me to do. Here goes.
Wow.
Because
so you were all in because you knew you were called to do it. So you just did it.
And what's wild is in my mind, very clearly, I heard, I've opened a door in heaven that no one can close.
Oh,
wow.
That's amazing.
And you know what, you guys, that is exactly what's happened. Like books go up and then down, right? But it's just continued to grow year after year for 10
You
years.
sold like well over 1 million copies. Most people are lucky to sell 5,000 copies of a book, if we're honest. I mean, this is just, book writing is very difficult. And because you've hit on something and you've done a wonderful job researching and providing that data, because I think that data helps the people who are like you were, right? Or who, even the way I think, right? And the way Jen thinks, so you want to be proven things. You want the information to help you say, okay, I see the experience, but what data do we have? What proof do we have? And that's where you and Lee Strobel and others do such a beautiful job.
Well, and I don't want people to go seeking out near-death experiences to form their view of God or heaven or hell. I want them to go to the scriptures.
Right.
Because because again, any one near-death experience, it can be shallow. Like if I leave my body, I have these superpowers, I feel wonderful. There's this nice welcoming committee who comes, and then boom, I'm back in my body. I can interpret that in a million ways.
Right. And there's no need
That
for
was actually the
salvation.
beginning experience of an atheist professor I interviewed. And if he had been resuscitated right then and not gone with the nice welcoming committee in the hallway of the hospital who looked like hospital staff, and he didn't realize he was dead because he thought when you die, there's nothing. So if he had been resuscitated right then, he would have said, hey, everybody goes to heaven. It's all good. Atheists have a wonderful afterlife. But that's not what happened. They led him into an outer darkness, just like Jesus described, and they turned on him and mauled him like the worst prison scene you can imagine, until finally he humbles himself enough to pray and cries out to Jesus, and Jesus rescues him.
Right.
Now, he comes back from a near-death experience he goes to Paris as an atheist tenured college professor. He has a near-death experience. He comes back, and 2 years later, he leaves his tenured professorship to become a Christian pastor. How do you explain that? His wife leaves him, divorces him because she's still an atheist. Thinks he's gone crazy.
That's amazing.
It's exactly like, Paul, who was Saul, persecuting Christians, didn't believe in Jesus. When this same brilliant God of light appears to him on the Damascus Road, Acts chapter 9, and he says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I'm Jesus, who you persecuted. And interestingly, I like to point out to Christians especially, Jesus didn't tell him the gospel. He didn't tell him what to do. He said, you'll be told. And he let Ananias come and explain things to him, because that's God's MO. I was always confused, like, all right, if this is the real God and not like a, angel, demonic angel described, what's the word? I'm totally blanking. Satan describes himself as disguises himself as an angel of light.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was always like, well, how do I know that's not the case? Right. And one of the things I realized, and one of the confusing parts, is that why didn't God just tell him, hey, I'm Jesus, here's what you're supposed to believe?
Right.
And then I started to realize, like, as if God couldn't do that right now if he wanted to.
Of course, he's so kind.
Right? No, there is something about honoring our free will and seeking. And if we seek, we will find, but we have to seek him with all our heart and with an open heart.
Yeah.
And you guys, I find that in so many of these near-death experiences, these Hindus or Buddhists or, Muslim imams I've interviewed, in their near-death experience, it's like God gives them a parable.
Wow.
And they come back, and when they seek, they find him.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's exactly what he did through Jesus. So shouldn't be surprising, but it was to me for a while. I was a little confused by that.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Well, John, this has been amazing. We want to have you back for a part 2, because there's actually more to unpack on this. And I mean, I feel like Jen said, we could have 10 hours of conversation with you and we wouldn't even scratch the surface. So we want to have you back again, and we appreciate you joining us on the show today.
No, I'd love to. And it was great talking with you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for stepping into the supernatural. A special thanks to John Burke for helping us look at eternity through the lens of faith and near-death encounters. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs a little more faith and wonder in their life. Until next time, keep your eyes open. There's more happening than meets the eye.